All right, welcome back to the podcast once again, everybody. As always, PayPal, Patreon, everything is down below for anybody who wants to support me. Only do so if you actually can. For this podcast episode, we're just going to run through the as up to this moment natural gas trends in production and consumption. So starting at the top with the U.S. The U.S. had hit a second peak of sorts in natural gas production, around 109 billion cubic feet per day, back right at the start of 2020, and it started slipping down, and the drilling rig count collapse brought about by the whole 2020 scenario kind of accelerated that a bit, dropped it all the way down to like 97. However, with renewed shale operations as the drilling rig count has recovered, that number has picked back up to around 103 or 104 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, in present day, U.S. natural gas consumption on average has reached the lower 90s or so, usually a bit above 90 billion cubic feet per day. For the other major consumer and producer nations across the world, looking at their evolving trends over the last decade, over the course of the 2010s, the total global natural gas consumption numbers back at the start of the 2010s, the previous decade, being at about 316 billion cubic feet per day for the global consumption number. And as of just before last year happened, that global total consumption level had gotten up to 390 billion cubic feet per day. Now, around specific nations in no particular order, starting with a decent natural gas supplier to Europe, Algeria has in recent times hit its peak of natural gas production, and that peak was at about 9.5 billion cubic feet per day, from which it has been gradually slipping down and is now about a bit above 8 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, as Algeria continues to rise and economically grow as a nation, their natural gas consumption levels have increased, and over the course of the 2010s, they increased from about 2.5 billion cubic feet per day of consumption domestically up to now about 4.5. Meanwhile, another one of Europe's non-Russia natural gas suppliers, Norway, they also hit their peak production recently. They got as high as 12.5 billion cubic feet per day and have since declined down to about 11, while their export ratio remains enormous, as their domestic natural gas consumption levels are pretty steady around only 450 million cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, across the North Sea from them, the UK also passed their peak. Granted, they passed theirs quite a while ago, and by the start of the 2010s, they were already down to 6 billion cubic feet per day, and over the course of the 2010s, they have since continued declining down to now only 4. Meanwhile, the UK's natural gas consumption has actually declined over the course of the 2010s. It dropped from about 10 at the start of the previous decade down to now about 7 or so. Russia, over the course of the past decade or so, has increased their natural gas production from about 60 up to now about 68 billion cubic feet per day, decently increasing their export numbers, as their own domestic natural gas consumption has only grown by about 2, from 42 up to 44 billion cubic feet per day. And down in the southeast, sort of Europe, sort of not Europe, Turkey has no real natural gas production. They do consume a bit of natural gas, however, particularly over the past decade. Their demand has grown from about 3.5 billion cubic feet per day up to about 4.5 now. Australia has greatly increased their natural gas production as they've been bringing online pretty decently sized fields off their northwestern coast. And over the past decade or so, they've increased their natural gas production from about 5 billion cubic feet per day to pumping out about 14 billion cubic feet per day, most of which is shipped off on LNG tankers to China, as China's demand has tripled over just the last 10 years. Meanwhile, Australia's natural gas consumption levels domestically have increased by about a third over the last decade or so, as they've been deactivating coal-fired power plants and replacing them with natural gas. They've gone from about 3 billion cubic feet per day of domestic consumption up to about 4. Meanwhile, in China, as we mentioned, their natural gas consumption levels have tripled over just the last decade, from only about 11 billion cubic feet per day of demand up to now, as of this year, consuming 33 billion cubic feet per day, of which they're able to domestically supply only less than 2/3 actually, whereas back when it was only 11, they supplied most of their own demand. Over the last 10 years, they have increased their natural gas production from about 9.5 billion cubic feet per day of production up to about 19. Over in the Persian Gulf, Qatar, the peninsula nation, which shares with Iran the massive Pars gas field. The field itself, in terms of area, is so massive it stretches from Qatar across the Gulf to Iran, and the field's reserves were enormous. Well, they still are, but when it was first discovered, it had something close to like 1.1 quadrillion cubic feet. Now, after being accessed and produced for a while, it's gone below the 1 quadrillion mark, and should be down around, I think, 960 trillion remaining. But anyways, in terms of Qatar's numbers, over the last decade or so, they've increased their production from 12 up to 17 billion cubic feet per day, most of which, about 14 or 13, they're able to ship out on LNG tankers, as their own domestic natural gas consumption had grown from about 2.5 billion cubic feet per day up to about 4, from which recently it's kind of slipped down to about 3.5. And across from them, Iran, again sharing that massive Pars gas field, has grown its production over the last decade or so from 14 up to about 25 billion cubic feet per day. However, they do not export anywhere near as much. Most of what they export goes through pipelines to Iraq to supply Iraq's power plants. As Iran's domestic natural gas consumption at the same time grew from about 14 up to 23 billion cubic feet per day, Saudi Arabia has just matched its natural gas production with its consumption numbers, which are increasing as they are switching their power generation over to natural gas instead of oil-fired power generation, because they want to cut their domestic oil consumption to boost their export ratio as it was shrinking. But they've only kept their natural gas production at their consumption levels. Everything else, assumably, they just flare it off. And so both their production and consumption numbers for natural gas followed the same trajectory, from 8 billion cubic feet per day about a decade ago up to now 11. Egypt, they have managed to keep their natural gas production on a plateau of sorts, at least for the last 10 years or so, at about 6 billion cubic feet per day. Power generation requirements have continued to increase as well, and Egypt's domestic natural gas consumption has now reached the same level as their production levels, growing from about 4 up to 6 billion cubic feet per day over the last 10 or 11 years. India has dropped in natural gas production from about 5 billion cubic feet per day down to only about 2.5 over the last 10 or 11 years. Meanwhile, India's natural gas consumption levels have remained pretty flat at about 6 billion cubic feet per day. Taiwan has no natural gas production or oil production. However, they do consume natural gas for some power generation, and their natural gas consumption over the last 10 or 11 years has increased from 1.5 billion cubic feet per day up to about 2.5. Meanwhile, South Korea also has no production. Their natural gas consumption has also increased over the last decade or so from about 4.5 up to about 5.5 billion cubic feet per day. Japan also, once again, no production. However, they do have a decent consumption level. Back at the start of the 2010s, they consumed about 10 billion cubic feet per day. When they shut down all their nuclear plants, that number jumped up to about 12.5, along with their coal consumption increasing. However, over the later 2010s and the past 2 years, that slipped back down to the prior 10 billion cubic feet per day after going as high as 12.5, as they wisely have been restarting their nuclear power plants Further down south, Indonesia, their natural gas production peaked a while ago, just like their oil production, particularly over the last 10 or 11 years. It declined from 9 further down to 6 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic natural gas consumption has remained pretty flat at about 4.5 billion cubic feet per day. And a bit north of them, Thailand peaked in natural gas production during the 2010s at about 4 billion cubic feet per day, since which they've slipped down in their decline down to about 3. Meanwhile, Thailand's domestic natural gas consumption has increased over the last 10 or 11 years from 4 billion cubic feet per day up to about 5. And Malaysia's natural gas production has actually been on the increase over the last decade. They've managed to bring it from 6.5 up to about 8 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic natural gas consumption has only increased from about 4 up to about 4.5. And back over in the Middle East, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, has increased their natural gas production from about 5 up to about 6 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic natural gas consumption has increased from about 6 to about 7. However, as they bring all 4 reactors of their nuclear power plant online, that number should drastically drop. And Oman has increased their natural gas production from 2.5 up to about 3.5 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption has increased from about 1.5 up to about 2.5. Pakistan has been slipping really slowly down from 3.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas production back at the start of the 2010s to now about flat 3. Pakistan's natural gas consumption has been increasing, and they've gone from 3.5 up to 4.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas demand. Israel has increased their natural gas production from about nothing up to about 1.5 billion cubic feet per day over the same course of time, which their natural gas consumption domestically has increased from about 500 million up to about a flat 1 billion cubic feet per day. The Netherlands could keep being a natural gas producer, but they have been intentionally shutting down their production, and over the 2010s they brought it down from 7.5 down to 3 billion cubic feet per day of production. Meanwhile, their natural gas consumption declined as well from 4.5 down to 3.5. Germany, their natural gas consumption has remained relatively the same at about 9 billion cubic feet per day. And Italy, natural gas consumption did slip down a bit over the 2010s, slipping down from about 8 down to 7 billion cubic feet per day. Trinidad and Tobago, slipping down from their height of both oil and natural gas production over the 2010s, dropping from 4 down to about 3 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption has also been decreasing, dropping from 2 down to about 1.5. Canada increased over some of the 2010s from 15 up to 17.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas production. Since then, it has been slipping down to now 16.5. Meanwhile, their natural gas consumption has gradually increased from 9 up to about 12, as they've also been switching coal-fired power generation over to natural gas. Mexico peaked in natural gas production a while ago, just like with their oil production, and by the start of the 2010s, they were already down to about 5 billion cubic feet per day, and over the course of the last 10 or 11 years, they dropped down to now about 3. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption has been increasing and has gone from 6.5 up to now about 9. Argentina has maintained a production plateau for the last decade or so of about 4 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic natural gas consumption has been increasing and has gone from 4 up to now rated about 5 billion cubic feet per day. And Brazil has become a decent oil producer, but not a decent gas producer. Their natural gas production over the last decade has only gone from about 1.5 up to about 2.5 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic natural gas consumption did increase over the 2010s, but their consumption peaked at about 4 and fell back down to where it had started, about 3. And we'll wrap it up with Turkmenistan, a Central Asian country with really large natural gas reserves, but not yet a large amount of natural gas production. They have increased their production from about 4 up to 6 billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption, as electricity usage increases and their power generation requirements increased from about 2 up to about 3 billion cubic feet per day. Alright, that's about it for this one. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are both down there for anybody who wants to support me. Only do so if you actually can. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.